So I might start by thanking Eduardo, one of our speakers, for that lovely animation, and he's got some great stuff coming up for the rest of you later. My name is Dr. Mark Jervin. I'm a psychiatry doctor working at St Vincent's Hospital here. I'm also a member of the Space Life Sciences Committee for aerospace, for the Australasian Society of Aerospace Medicine. I'd first like to thank Thomas and Giuseppe for inviting myself and my colleagues to speak here and to participate in these discussions with you all. It's a real honour at such an interesting time for space research. The world we live in is changing incredibly swiftly. This has been incredibly apparent for myself because I've recently had a young daughter, and it's really brought this into focus for me as I've been looking at her and thinking about the world that I grew up in, where we had the space shuttle, and we've seen 20 years almost of people continuously in orbit in the space station. And the next decades are going to be incredibly change. There's going to be incredible change. We're going to see the return to the moon, the reaching out towards Mars, and then the first stages of human settlement. Now, this might come within a decade if we listen to the optimism of Elon Musk, or it might take a few decades, but this work is inexorable, and the opportunities that arise in its wake are incredible possibilities for us to drive forward things back home. So obviously our interest is in healthcare and where that is going to be impacted by space research. The Space Life Sciences Committee has it's got two goals. The first is to look at Australia's work in all aspects of healthcare and human environments, and see how we can look at supporting Australia and having a part in the missions that are going to take place, the international missions back to the moon and onwards after that. The second is to use those opportunities to channel that research into improving all aspects of healthcare in our environment and to generate useful intellectual property and advances in our hospitals and other healthcare resources. There's many questions that need to be answered from a medical point of view. People are going to get injured on missions as they do, back here. So how do you treat someone in a spacesuit on the surface of the moon? How do you get them back into a habitat? When you don't have a hospital of resources, how do you help them? And then on a bigger picture, how do you create a sustainable closed environment, an environment where a human can live, where we'd like to have completely recyclable food, air, and water? And then how does that technology affect how we can be more sustainable here on Earth? Australia is incredibly well placed for this research. Our remote medical care and work in isolated areas is something we're all quite familiar with. I'm sure you've all heard of the Royal Flying Doctors, and many of you have heard of the Australian Antarctic Division. Supporting people in hard-to-reach places is a mark of pride in this country, and those resources are perfect for translation into this sort of work. So to start giving you a taste of some of these challenges and how Australian researchers are looking to address them, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Gordon Cable is a specialist in aerospace medicine, a senior aviation medical officer for both the Defence Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, and currently head of aerospace medicine training at the RAF Institute of Aviation Medicine. Gordon is also the founding chair of the Space Life Sciences Committee and works tirelessly each year on top of his usual workload to convene our annual Humans in Space Bioastronautics course. He's a fellow of the Australasian College of Aerospace Medicine, the Aerospace Medical Association, the Royal Aeronautical Society, the International Academy of Aviation, and Space Medicine. Additionally, he's a clinical associate professor at the School of Medicine at the University of Adelaide and a senior lecturer at the University of Tasmania. In 2005, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his contributions in the area of aerospace medicine. His professional interests are in altitude physiology of hypoxia and hyperbaric decompression illness, hypoxia awareness training for military and civilian air crews. That's lack of oxygen for anyone who's not familiar with the word. And postgraduate education in aerospace medicine for many medical professionals, where he's a mentor for myself and many, many of my colleagues. Gordon will be speaking about the effects of the space environment on the human body. So with that, I'd like to invite Gordon Cable.
Thanks very much, Mark, and it's lovely to see so many interested faces in the audience. I'd like to start with a question, though. This is a question for you guys. When did humans first reach the moon? What year did we do that? Did we call out? 67. Got a 67. Any further thoughts? Reaching the moon. So most people, when you ask that question, what do you think they would say? It's with the 50th anniversary this year, right? So Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong's first foot on the moon, one giant leap for mankind. We first reached the moon in 1959. It was Lunik 2, it was a Russian probe. But which one does everyone remember? The human mission. Because you frequently hear the question, why do we bother sending humans to space? Why do we go to the moon? We heard a lot about robotics and mining in the last session. Why do we need humans to go at all when we have these autonomous systems and these robots that can do it for us? And I think I just answered that question, because people remember the human exploration aspects, and it's part of our nature to be explorers and to ask what's over the next hill and to send humans, because there is nothing that beats that human experiential actually being there. But it is challenging. So I want to ask you the question then, how can we survive on the moon? If we choose to go, how do we survive? And there are a number of challenges involved in that. I'm going to touch on a few of them, and my colleagues in the panel are going to mention a number of these challenges as well as we go through this session. But NASA defines the biggest challenges they see in deep space exploration as those. So altered gravity fields, isolation and confinement, hostile closed environments, the distances that we are now looking at, and radiation, deep space radiation. This is going to be different now if we go to the moon, and if we go beyond the moon to Mars. We've been locked in low Earth orbit now since Apollo. We haven't really left low Earth orbit. That environment is entirely different once we go beyond the magnetosphere of the Earth and we are suddenly in deep space and we're faced with planetary exploration of these other bodies. So I'm going to touch on some of these issues, and I'll leave my colleagues to discuss some of the others. One of the most challenging things NASA and ESA and other agencies have to face is to try and work out how we protect humans from radiation. The radiation in space is far different to what we experience on the surface of this planet and what astronauts experience on the ISS in low Earth orbit. They have some protection there. They're actually not completely out of the atmosphere, interestingly. They're in the thermosphere of the atmosphere. They're within the Earth's magnetic field, which protects them. They get more radiation than Earth, but it's not as bad as deep space. Earth is an unusual situation. We live in a bunker. The entire universe is bathed in radiation. That's the normal situation. We're the exception. We live in this shielded bunker, and as soon as we leave that shielded bunker, we are suddenly exposed to radiation from the sun in greater amounts than what we experience here because of our atmosphere and magnetic field. And there's galactic cosmic radiation, which comes from energized gas clouds and supernova explosions throughout the galaxy that spews out particles, radiation ionized particles at very high energy, high velocity. So it's a very different environment and very challenging for human physiology to cope with all of that. From the moon's perspective, we're going to be exposed primarily to more radiation from the sun, which comes at us at fairly low velocity, but in high flux. So they tend to be positively charged protons, alpha particles, which are essentially a helium nucleus, and there's this constant background solar wind, as we call it. But from time to time, there is a solar flare. There is a large solar particle event, which is sufficient radiation to cause acute radiation sickness for astronauts. During the Apollo era, we were very lucky. We missed one of those events by a matter of days or weeks during one of the Apollo missions. The astronauts got home in time. But on the moon, that's going to be a potential problem of exposure. The lucky thing is we have warning time. The exposure takes time to get to us and to the moon. There's sufficient time, hopefully, to get astronauts into a shelter. The galactic cosmic radiation is ubiquitous. It's coming at us from all directions, every direction in space. We are protected to some extent by the planetary shielding effect. So on the moon, we're protected from half of it by the fact we're on a planetary surface. Half the radiation from one direction is shielded by the rock of the moon, which is great. So you'd probably expect to see maybe 1.5 to 2 times the radiation exposure that astronauts currently see on the ISS. Partial gravity. Everybody knows that we go to space, we're weightless on the ISS, but that's not true on the moon. We've got 1/6 Earth gravity on the moon, and we really don't have a lot of experience with 1/6 gravity. We have absolutely zero experience with 3/8 gravity, which is what we'll feel on Mars. We have lots and lots of experience with microgravity. And I don't say 0G because there's no such thing as no gravity. In that constant free-fall environment of the ISS, you're in a microgravity environment, and we've done a lot of research on how that affects your physiology. But how many people have walked on the moon in history? You know? 12. 12 humans have been in 1/6 gravity in the entirety of human history. And they were only there for a few days. It was a camping trip compared to what we're currently contemplating, seriously. So we need to learn a lot more about what that actually means, how we deal with it. Gravity affects humans in very, very serious ways. It affects our blood pressure. It affects the way that our reflexes work to maintain blood pressure. It affects the way our heart pumps blood around the body because the heart deconditions if it doesn't have to work so hard. The fluids shift around. Getting to the moon's a 3-day trip, but going to Mars is going to be 7 months of microgravity. And one of the biggest problems we're facing at the moment, and we think it's a gravity problem, is that astronauts' eyes and their eyesight deteriorate in microgravity. And it's a permanent change when they come back to Earth. It doesn't recover. They end up with nearsightedness. It's like the presbyopia you get with age where you can't read the fine print. And there's a lot of research going on at the moment to try and work out how we fix that. And we don't really know whether that's going to be a problem in lunar gravity. Hopefully not. I think, as they say, some gravity is better than no gravity. But the other problem is bones and muscles. Muscles waste away, they atrophy in microgravity, and in partial gravity, similarly, we don't have to lift as much, we're not loaded as much. Our anti-gravity muscles don't have to work as hard, so they don't bother, they just waste away. Bones demineralise, calcium washes out of bones, and we end up with a condition very similar to what we see in patients on Earth with osteoporosis. The bone demineralisation, the calcium washes out, the bones get thinner, and once astronauts return to Earth, it does take months and months sometimes to recover the normal bone architecture. Now, the best way to fix this is exercise. And at the moment, astronauts exercise for 2 hours a day, every day, on the ISS to maintain healthy bones and healthy muscles and healthy hearts. And it's a great countermeasure. It works really well. But you know what? We don't know what to prescribe in terms of exercise in a 1/6 gravity environment because we have no experience with that. So there's a lot of work going on in how we exercise, even how we locomote about the planet. We don't know how we're going to effectively move about on the planetary surface. The big problem is gravity transitions. If you're in microgravity for a long time and then you come back to even a partial gravity field, it's very difficult to walk, it's difficult to see, you feel dizzy, you feel motion sick, your blood pressure may not be quite so good, and it takes a few days to recover from that. For the moon, this may not be such a big issue, 3 days, so what? But Mars, 7 months, there is a high likelihood that astronauts will need to live in the lander as a habitat for probably 3 or 4 days to get their Mars legs before they adapt from a balance and posture point of view until they get their cardiovascular reflexes back a little bit, and then they can start ambulating and doing what they need to do. It's the transitions that are the problem. If we went to space and never came home, we'd stay adapted to microgravity and it wouldn't be a problem. But the thing is, we want to bring our astronauts back healthy. Lunar dust is another big problem. You've probably all heard of coal miner's lung, silicosis. There is a problem with lunar dust, we think, from a medical point of view. It's toxic stuff. The Apollo astronauts experienced some of this. You can see the dust stuck on that spacesuit, that EVA suit. It got into the LEM. It caused, in some of the astronauts, a problem that got called lunar hay fever. They had streaming eyes, coughing, sneezing, these respiratory symptoms, which were probably as a result of this dust, which is very, very fine, like talcum powder, but highly corrosive. There's no weathering forces on the moon. The dust is sharp-angled, corrosive. It erodes seals and mechanical parts. It sticks to solar arrays. It levitates from the lunar surface and sticks to everything because of electrostatic charge. The ionising radiation bombarding the lunar surface electrostatically charges the dust. It levitates a couple of metres above the surface, sticks to everything. That's going to be a hard problem that we've got to try and mitigate. We're going to need to do some really good occupational medicine in terms of environmental monitoring, biological monitoring, respiratory function testing, monitoring astronauts' lungs to make sure this is not a problem, because potentially it could be a big problem. This stuff, we've known from recent studies, kills cells in cell cultures. So brain cells and lung cells die when exposed to lunar dust. So we have to be very careful about how we mitigate that risk. The other problem is the pressure on the moon. Now, we, on the ISS have pretty much sea level pressure, sea level temperature, sea level oxygen concentration. The only difference with the ISS environment is it's a microgravity environment. It's the gravity that's different. So it's a laboratory for microgravity. On the moon, it's a hard vacuum. There is no atmosphere at all. To do EVA on the moon, you need to be inside your own personal little spaceship. So that EVA suit has to be able to support oxygenation and pressure for human beings. Without oxygen, we become hypoxic, our brains don't work. As pressure decreases, nitrogen bubbles out of our system and we can end up with decompression illness or sickness. And even worse than that, if we're exposed to extremely low pressure, water vapour in the body starts to vaporise and form bubbles in a condition that we call ebullism. So if a suit depressurised like that, on the surface of the moon, if there was a slip, trip, fall, breach of the suit integrity, an astronaut would only literally have a matter of seconds, probably up to a maximum of a minute potentially, based on some research done with accidental exposures to vacuum, before they would succumb and die. So it's a very hostile environment. And we need to also think about how we mitigate the risk of decompression illness, where EVA is going to be very different now. EVA, extravehicular activity, is going to be on a contingency basis. We're doing a lot more of it because we're exploring. On the ISS, it's outside maintaining the station, highly planned, lots of preparation. You only do a few of them. But on the moon and on Mars, we're going to be in and out of a habitat or lander, constantly exploring, mining, constructing, whatever it is that we're doing, which means pressure transitions from habitat to suit back to habitat are going to be frequent and predisposing to decompression illness more than we've ever seen before with EVA activities on the International Space Station. The way to mitigate that is by varying the pressures in the habitat. So currently it is being looked at, for instance, to use what we call exploration atmospheres. So living in an atmosphere which is lower pressure but oxygen enriched, which helps wash nitrogen out of your body, and the transition from a habitat pressure to a suit pressure is a much less traumatic transition. Suits like that, Apollo suit and the ones currently used on the ISS, the pressure in the suit is 4.3 pounds per square inch. On the surface of the planet here, it's 14.7. It's equivalent to about 30,000 feet of altitude, and they're exposed to that altitude for many, many hours during an EVA. Interestingly, on the space station, we have had absolutely zero incidents of decompression illness problems. I contend that when we start ambulating on the surface of a planet where there is much more motion, movement, lifting and work going on, that the risk of that will increase. At the moment, we have no way of treating that on the ISS. So that's a bit of an overview of some of those environmental considerations for lunar operations. Why do we need people on the moon when we have robots with all these risks that are attendant upon it? Well, I think it's because robots need to be maintained. Even if we did purely robotic operations, there will need to be humans there to assist the robots, even if not in great numbers. But apart from that, it's purely the exploration, I think, that's important. We have in our genes, in our DNA, a need to explore, and I think we will continue to do that up to and including the lunar surface, Mars and beyond. So hopefully I haven't gone longer than my 10-minute allocated slot, Mark. I'm being kept to strict time, I know, but at that point I'm going to hand back over to Mark, and I think we're going to leave questions until the end, aren't we, for the public discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gordon. The one thing that also comes to mind is when you were talking about the lunar dust and the big challenges that we face in trying to do these things, is by finding ways to manage those challenges, how will we be able to make things easier and safer here on Earth, for, as you said, in coal mining and many other areas. I think the radiation work is osteoporosis, making safer radiation cancer treatments, etc. But without ado, I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Dr. Rowena Christensen is another member of the Space Life Science Committee. She's a medical educator at the Melbourne Medical School. She also works as a pre-hospital emergency doctor and life support instructor. She's undertaken postgraduate training in emergency medicine, crit care, women and children's health, aviation medicine, space studies, and disaster health and emergency management. Rowena has interests in aerospace medicine, extreme environments, and wilderness medicine. She's the chair of the Australian Ski Patrol Association Medical Advisory Committee and sits on the Australian Resuscitation Council and the Board of Directors for the Mars Society Australia and the World Association for Disaster and Emergency Management. Rowena is currently undertaking research related to expeditionary medicine and resuscitation science. Her career trajectory prior to entering medicine was as a lawyer and businesswoman. Rowena is going to give us an introduction into how we actually provide medical care in space and some of the challenges we need to overcome in order to support human spaceflight to the moon. Thanks very much, Rowena.
Just let me change my glasses. Great, so I am basically going to give you a whistle-stop tour through some of the challenges that we face when we're trying to perform clinical medicine in a space environment. I'm going to talk quickly about the planning that we need to do, issues with communications and evacuation, telemedicine and robotic surgery, the equipment and pharmaceutical supplies that we might need, nutritional support, which you might not immediately think is something which is an obvious part of medicine, what type of doctor we want to take, and also just some of the special issues for surgery and anaesthesia in microgravity or low gravity environments. So human missions always require a great deal of planning, and we need to have the right people, the right equipment, and we also need to have levels of redundancy, because once we're out there, we're going to be pretty well unsupported and we're going to need to manage things on our own. We also need to take the right sort of people who are fit and healthy and not so likely to develop medical problems. If we're thinking about things like communication for telemedicine, there's not too much of a delay for the International Space Station or the Moon, but once we're getting out to Mars, there's potentially quite a long delay of between 8 and 24 minutes, depending on where Mars is in its orbit. And if we have someone who's very unwell, evacuation might be quite reasonable from the International Space Station, but even with Mars, we're looking at around 3 days, so we wouldn't want them to be too unstable if we're thinking about sending them back to Earth. And of course, it's just not possible to evacuate somebody quickly from Mars. Telemedicine will certainly play a part. It's very useful for getting advice and potentially instructions. For instance, if you have someone with swelling on the brain and you want to drill a burr hole into the side of their temple to relieve the pressure, that's something that's been done via telemedicine here on Earth already. But there will be some dependencies. You'll need the right equipment, you'll need to have a stable electrical supply, the communication delay will be a factor, and you'll also need good space weather, so no solar flares that are going to get in the way. And it's going to need to be more of a backup strategy than something that we're going to rely upon. This is a picture of a robotic surgery procedure. In the bottom left, you can see the surgeon staring into a screen, manipulating the instruments, and then we have the patient on the table with the robot actually doing the surgery. There are two models, one where the operator and the robot and the patient are all in the same room, and the other model where the patient is in one place and the person who's operating the controls is at a distance. And depending on the communications delay, that may be feasible for some types of surgery, but there would be the same dependencies as for telemedicine that I've just mentioned. NASA's also looking into the possibility of autonomous surgical robots, but if you've ever seen the movie Prometheus, I'm not so sure about whether that's a good idea. And also, in reality, it's maybe a bit more likely that somebody will be trained up on the spot via a video or additional instructions to be able to perform the procedure. We'll need to have laboratory tests. Blood tests are always going to be an important part of medicine, but they're going to need to be something we can take with us that's going to be stable. It's not going to deteriorate too quickly. And we're probably not going to be able to have established laboratory facilities with high level of specialised tests until colonisation is well established. We're also going to need some access to medical imagery because being able to see inside the body is a very important part of what we do in terms of working out what's wrong with people. Ultrasound is already being used on the International Space Station, and it's probably the most portable of our imaging modalities. And there are also small handheld versions which are currently being used by cardiologists. If we're thinking about X-ray machines or CT scanners or MRI scanners, they're fantastic pieces of equipment, but they're very, very large and heavy. And so there may well be practical constraints in terms of taking them on a spacecraft and transporting them elsewhere. So that might be something that will need to come in the second wave of getting a colony established, for instance. We're going to need to take medicines with us to deal with common emergencies, and perhaps also supportive things like vitamins and minerals. Once again, there'll be logistical issues. We're going to be stuck with what we can take with us. We're going to want it to be stable in transit, so shelf life could be a problem. And there's also a question of the risk of degradation due to cosmic radiation. You might ask why nutritional support is something I've highlighted as important, and that's because we need our astronauts to be as healthy as possible, and that's been highlighted by NASA as one of the risks for human space exploration. In particular, we need to have a good, strong immune system and good wound healing capabilities, and there's quite a lot of research to show that our immune system works less well in extreme environments such as the space environment. Food security is always going to be an important issue, and there's certainly a lot of research into growing your own food, but at the moment this is mainly around plant-based food. And if you have a purely vegan or vegetarian diet, you're not going to get all your nutritional needs from that diet, and so supplementation may be required. And it's also important to have a good gut microbiome to support our immune system. So you need a good balance on both prebiotic and probiotic foods. So fermented foods for the probiotics and fibre-rich foods for the prebiotics. In terms of the type of doctor that we want to take, we need to think about whether we want to take generalists like emergency doctors or GPs, or specialists, or a mixture of both. And the elephant in the room relates to the fact that humans will be humans and the risk that somebody may fall pregnant, and then how do you manage a pregnancy and childbirth in a microgravity or low gravity environment. And gravity is also the elephant in the room for surgery and anaesthesia. I couldn't find any papers on surgery on the moon, so I'm just going to talk about a microgravity environment. But liquid containment is a real issue. If you have venous blood, it will tend to pool where it's oozing out, which will get in the way of everything, and arterial blood will spurt into all those lovely little globules that you've probably seen floating around in science fiction movies. And bacteria will always be hanging around in the air, and you'll risk both the wound getting contaminated or bacteria actually getting stuck in a cavity. Some possible solutions: NASA's looking at putting a fluid-filled dome on top of the patient and operating through that. And there's also research on using focused ultrasound to perform surgery. So both of those are quite interesting ideas. With anaesthetics, there are also problems as well, because if we use vaporous anaesthetics, they'll just hang around in the air and we might run the risk of anaesthetising everyone. And also the changes in physiology that Gordon mentioned could have an impact. So the lessons from pre-hospital medicine are probably going to be useful, and perhaps more of an emphasis on just anaesthetising the part of the body that you're operating on, if that's a reasonable thing to do. So in conclusion, there are many challenges for clinical medicine. They're all interrelated. There'll be a lot of trial and error, but that's the way that we're going to learn. And success is going to come through teamwork, not just through the efforts of one person. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rowena. I specifically liked how you spoke about nutrition. Because, you know, in the medical training you get these days, there's a real focus on holistic health, the greater picture of health. So it's not just medical treatments, but also, you know, exercise, how you eat, the environments we live in, the people you work with, all these sort of aspects, which are so important. It's what's called the biopsychosocial model, with biological, psychological, and social. And speaking of which, I think that's a really good transition into our next speaker. So Dr. Omar Eduardo Rodriguez is our next speaker. Like myself, he's a medical doctor working in psychiatry. He's currently a neuroradiology registrar at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and a pre-fellow of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. He completed a Bachelor of Medicine and Economics and then went on to become a Director of Management and Development at St John of God Health Organisation. Then after a few years decided to pursue his lifelong aspiration in the space industry and neurosciences. Then he pursued pilot training as well as completed a Master's in Space Studies with the International Space University in France. Then in 2017, he enrolled in the Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program, which is held annually in Adelaide, which quite a few people in the room, I think, are graduates of. He is a former scholar and researcher from NASA Ames, where he worked in the Fatigue Countermeasures Laboratory. He also participated in a Mars medical analog mission as crew health and neuropsychiatry officer. He was also selected by the International Institute for Astronautical Science in the United States as a scientist-astronaut candidate, and his research interests are in fatigue, sleep studies, and the broader neuropsychiatry aspects of space in analog missions and in parabolic flight. Dr. Rodriguez is going to take a slightly different tact as he speaks about a very important but often overlooked area of human spaceflight, that of being confined in a spacecraft, being surrounded by the dangers of a different environment, and the immense toll this takes on the psychological health of astronauts, which can place the entire mission in jeopardy if not managed properly. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Rodriguez.
Okay, my objective with this presentation is to identify some neurological, psychological, and psychiatric aspects in space exploration, particularly in the moon, and to recognize one of the problems that we will face in case that we colonize the moon or Mars. So, as a human beings, we have been in a process of evolution. We have been, in the jungle, then we conquer the cities, we conquer different worlds here in the air, we conquer different continents, and this is part of our inner soul to go beyond. As I say, Constantine, air is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in a cradle forever. So let's go to think for 1 second. Let's go to think that you are going to camping. You will feel anxious to go for camping? What will be the fears that you will have if you go for camping? Just let's go to think for a few seconds. You are going to camping to the mountains. What will you bring with you? What will be the fear that you are in the mountains? You are feared for animals. You are feared for be sick, be far away from home. Okay, let's go to say, we are going to be to the mountains, to the Everest, to the Himalayas. You know, high altitude, I need to be scared, you know. Okay. Now you are going to the Antarctic. What will be the fear that you have? A little bit more scary, you know. You get sick, what happened? So there are so many stress that we had to face. So for 1 second, let's go to say that we are going to the moon, okay? And let's go to try to experience what would be our fears. So just for 1 second to see what happened. Okay. Now I want to ask you guys, what do you feel if you are going to the moon? What will you feel if you are in the rocket? Just feel free to say. Sorry? Lost. Lucky. Okay, very lucky. Okay. Any other emotions? Scared. Very scared. Why scared? Exactly, we don't know, you know. Any other feelings? Sorry? Adrenaline, yeah, I can imagine, you know. So let's go for 1 second. You're in the rocket and you feel the vibration, the noise, you don't know what happened. Anything could be wrong, you know. This is the stress that actually astronauts are going to experience. And actually it's going to impact into the mental stability. So as Gordon said before, there are different elements. One is the confinement. So you know that when you are here in the air, we will have our own space. When you are in the moon or in space, there is no more. We lost this like privacy. You know, everyone knows what you are doing. And you have to share your own emotions with other people. How do you feel about that? How about the isolation? You sometimes feel your family when you are far away, when you are in a trip. You know, what happens if you are in the mountains? Maybe you feel your family. What happens if you go to the moon and you will be there for quite a long period of time? You could be very isolated and can take really impact into your emotional state. And they can maybe feel people to feel depressed. How about the low gravity? You know, the impact into all our body fluids, how they can change our physiology. They also can impact into our mental state. Different risks, as you say, someone say, it's scary. Of course it's scary, because we can die. And always we face this situation that if something is going wrong, we can die very easily. So we are going to explore the unknown. So this continual risk is going to affect our emotion as well. Of course, stress, because you have a lot of responsibility to be in the space. And you can be sick because it costs a lot of money to put someone there. So it continuous stress that you have to perform a high level and the expectation of people that you have to accomplish, your goals over there. The stress that, asteroid impact, the stress that the machine is not working, the stress that you are far away from family, the stress that you have new food. There's so many stresses that you are experiencing every day. The radiation, I said before, we don't know what happened in deep space exploration, but some research has shown that animal mice, they can get Alzheimer's when they are in space because of the high radiation. So we don't know what happened. Maybe we send one to moon, and after 1 week, 2 weeks, the radiation really can damage the brain. The sleep is another problem, We here in our home, we have our comfortable bed, we have some 8 hours, okay? What happened, we are in the space, our sleep is completely changed, 1 day in the moon, how long does it take 1 day in the moon? 14 days, it's around 28 days, I think, by memory, 28 days? 28, exactly, yeah. So we change completely our circadian cycle, Our pattern of sleeping day and night is changed. And we know for research that when the sleeping change, when our sleeping pattern change, we have more tendency to have mental problems. So one of the main aspects in space is the cognition. Our cognition deteriorates because all these stresses that I said before. So we can perform at the level that we do here in the air. There is a high risk of suffering from depression. So far, there is only 1 case has been reported in the International Space Station. But in long term, there is a high chance. And we know that in analog missions, and like in Antarctic or in submarine, we know that 5% of the people suffer from major mental illnesses. So even though we don't know, there is a high chance that the astronauts they can suffer from depression. And one of the problems is that we are expecting the astronauts to report the problems, and many times they don't report, so they hide this information. So in fact, we don't know if they are depressed or not. Another problem is all the psychological illness, psychotic illness. So far, we don't have any astronaut who have been suffering from a psychotic illness or mania at the moment, but we don't know in long-term space exploration. Psychological phenomena, there are different aspects in the space. As you can guess, you can feel it. Just for 1 second, you are thinking you are in space. One is the adjustment reaction, which is the normal adjustment that everyone suffers to a new environment. And they have to suffer that, and we know they suffer. There are one case report, an astronaut suffered from somatoformal disorder. He thought that his teeth were falling out. And he was very, very sure that it would happen. When he came out to the air, he was fine. And another problem is suicidality. There is no any report so far, I couldn't find it, any report of suicidality. But as I said before, many information is hiding, so we don't know yet. Now the social aspects. You are living in a very small space, sharing this with 3 or 4 people that you don't know. Maybe they are different culture, different countries, different background, different language. How you can deal with this in long period of time, and how they can affect into the performance. And there are different analog missions, like one is the 500 Days Mars, which has different papers have been writing about this. What happens when you are living in these environments, sharing with other people? All the dynamics, all the leadership, all the anger, all the frustration, how you can deal this with other people. So, some messages to take home. We know that it's our dream to go. It's not easy. As we discussed in November 2017, the Fifth Moon Village meeting, it's a long way to go to make safe to the human to be in space, and particularly to be safe and cognitively, and to be safe that the astronaut is able to perform in a high level. The good point with this is that there are different research. When I was in NASA, we were working particularly in sleeping issues and to see how we can predict fatigue in astronauts in space. And all this technology, by sure, in 10, 20 years, we can use this technology in our everyday life. So this is one of the dreams that I have, that everything that we develop for space, we are going to use in the air, here in our everyday life in the future. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I think so many things you spoke about, really, there's such a tactile element to them that the visuals really give you that sense of what it feels like and how that impacts you. And I think that's incredibly important when you think about how people cope with these missions and these projects that we plan. And in the picture of how people cope with things, the other aspect is how you set up groups of people and organizations, which again is my little transition into Quinn's talk. Not very subtly. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker. Quinn is a data scientist, technologist, and clinical researcher. He's worked as a scientist for the European Space Agency and has only recently returned from the European Astronaut Center in Cologne, Germany. His space medicine research includes investigating hypergravity-related physiology to inform the development of effective countermeasures to maintain the health of future astronauts on long-duration deep space missions to the Moon and to Mars. He has 10 years of experience working as a management consultant across healthcare, health services, aerospace, and non-profit sectors. He holds a master's in organizational psychology, a master's in information systems, and is currently completing a medical doctorate. He's also authored 20 medical research papers. His presentation today is titled A Field Guide to Exploring the Moon as a Deep Space Astronaut, and is intended to give you a feel for what it might be like for one of humanity's next great envoys as we forge deep into the solar system, take our next tentative steps on the surface of another planet, and see a lunar-based Earthrise again for the first time in half a century. One of those next envoys of humanity could be one of yourselves. And so with that, I'd like to invite Quinn to the podium.
Great, thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, team. Congratulations on getting through astronaut selection. You're an astronaut and you're going to the moon. No one's been up there for about 50 years, and a lot has changed. It's going to be a far cry from the bouncing spacemen of Apollo, so listen carefully. Welcome to your first field training briefing. The intent is to talk about your upcoming moon mission and the technology that's being developed to keep you safe. So you all know this place well. This is the European Space Agency's European Astronaut Center in Cologne, Germany, and you'll spend 2 years here training prior to your first mission. There are thousands of people all over the world developing powerful new technologies to keep you safe on your moon exploration operations. When the time comes, you'll be assigned a flight and you'll ride a column of fire blazing a hole in the sky. It'll be everything you've ever dreamed of and more. After minutes of intense roaring and vibrations and G-forces so strong it feels like a gorilla is sitting on your chest, this is the view you'll see out the window. You'll experience microgravity for the first time, and you'll spend a while preparing for transfer to the moon. When the time's right, you'll fire the boosters and you'll be away. This is your spacecraft. This is your life support, the Orion. It'll take about a week to get there, a week of confinement, a week of isolation, a week of stiff and sore legs, but also a week of wonder, a week of learning to fly in microgravity, and a week of journeying into the blackness to a bright orb in the distance. Radiation, as we've heard, is one of the most significant problems faced by deep space astronauts. And there are a series of strategies and tactics being developed to mitigate its risks. Things from building hard shielding into spacesuits to building shielding into spacecraft, using water as a radiation shield in spacecraft, and also biosciences approaches, strategies to reduce the likelihood of DNA damage as a result of radiation, and strategies to optimize DNA repair. When you get there, this will be a new home. This is NASA's Lunar Gateway. It's no mansion, but it's got everything you'll need to have a successful 12-month mission. You'll be exposed to microgravity the entire time you're there in orbit around the moon on the gateway. Your musculoskeletal system will slowly start dissolving because it's no longer needed to work against Earth's gravity. The fluid will shift towards your head, and your cardiovascular system will start to change. Your vision will also start to change over time. So to mitigate the effects of these issues and to keep you healthy, to keep you functioning, you're going to have to work out for hours every day. This is a resistance exercise device that operates to simulate weightlifting by pulling against the force of vacuum tubes. Your spine also degrades when it's exposed to microgravity as well, and this is a device developed by the European Space Agency called the skin suit. Your spine loses bone density, and as it degrades, it increases the risk of vertebral fracture and intervertebral disc herniation, particularly as we heard when you land. So this suit exerts longitudinal pressure down the length of your spine to keep it loaded and to keep it healthy. You'll be wearing this a lot on your mission in the Lunar Gateway. You'll also have AI assistants to monitor your health, your diet, and your work, and to provide you with recommendations to optimize your performance. This is Simon, developed by Airbus and DLR. You'll start your work by operating robotic systems on the surface of the moon, investigating areas of interest and collecting important data from the safety of the Lunar Gateway. This is one of the robotic systems developed by the European Space Agency for that purpose. Okay, so you and the person next to you have been assigned as EVA partners. EVA stands for extravehicular activity and describes the activity of walking on the surface of the moon. So one of you is call sign Pegasus, the other is call sign Eagle. Get to know each other well. Your survival and the success of the mission will depend on it. So when the time is right, you'll enter the transfer vehicle and you'll make your way down to the surface for the first time. It's an exciting environment. The level of gravity on the moon is 16% that of the Earth's gravity. It's a place where you can jump about a story high. You can easily do a double backflip from standing. And physiology research actually suggests that humans can run on liquid water in moon's gravity. But it's also hostile. There's nothing out there but you, your colleagues, the robots, radiation, and moon dust. Not even a skerrick of oxygen for comfort. Your mission will be to conduct experiments, to explore the surface, to liaise with scientists and mission controllers on the Lunar Gateway and back on Earth. You'll also start the process of constructing infrastructure on the surface of the moon, because the plan is to transition from the Lunar Gateway to a permanent installation on the moon's surface, and you will begin constructing it. You'll also start work on in situ resource utilization infrastructure to gather resources that can be used for life support, fuel, and construction materials. This is what one of the HABs might look like. You can see the pressurized area where astronauts live. You can see the technical support module, the airlock, and the 3D printed wall that will protect you from radiation. People are looking into how to 3D print that protective shell out of moon dust or regolith. People are also looking into how to apply augmented reality and virtual reality systems to optimize the interior of that environment, to reduce the effects of isolation on astronauts, and to maximize psychological well-being. You'll also be working in a team to explore geological features, areas of interest, and cave systems. And in the course of your work, in the course of exploring the surface, constructing infrastructure, and exploring geological features, you're going to have to look after each other. So what happens, Pegasus, when Eagle trips on a moon rock, falls into a crater, and breaks a leg? Well, you can't just pick them up and drag them because your spacesuit is too limiting. You can't move appropriately. You can't effect that kind of rescue. So this is a system developed by the European Space Agency to mobilize an incapacitated astronaut and put them on a mobile platform for transport. So Pegasus, you're on this platform now, and Eagle is dragging you to the transfer vehicle, and you're going to be safe. Once you get back to the transfer vehicle and back up onto the Lunar Gateway, you'll use a system like this. This is the Tempest Pro, developed by the European Space Agency and Remote Diagnostic Technologies in the UK. It's a system that incorporates technologies like ultrasound to do an initial survey and to facilitate medical management planning in the emergency environment. But Pegasus, you've rescued Eagle, but in your haste to get back to the Lunar Gateway, some regolith has come in through the airlock and it permeates the environment inside the gateway, and some of it's gotten into your eyes. As we saw, it's sharp, it's like shattered glass, and it's scratching the surface of your eyeballs, but you can't just wash it out. Water behaves in unpredictable ways in microgravity, and it's a precious resource. So you're going to have to use a closed-loop system like this to wash your eyes out. This is developed by NASA and ESA. And Eagle, what if you get a toothache? Well, Pegasus, you're going to have to manage it. Like I said, get to know each other well. NASA and ESA are also developing 3D printing technologies to print surgical tools, to print organs and bone to solve medical problems on deep space exploration missions, but these things are still in development. So after 12 months, you will detach from the Lunar Gateway, you'll be in your Orion, and you'll take one last look at the barren wild landscape of the moon as it recedes into the distance. You'll have a little bit of time to enjoy your last moments of microgravity in orbit around the Earth as you prepare for re-entry. And then Orion will detach from the space station and make its fiery way back down to Earth. You'll be traveling at over 20,000 kilometers an hour, and you'll be enveloped in a cocoon of blazing plasma that ranges from bright white to orange to purple to cherry red. And then boom, splashdown, you've made it home, you're safe. You'll be transferred back to the European Astronaut Centre in Cologne, where the medical team will make sure that your recovery is a good one. For your first days and weeks back on Earth, it'll take a while for you to adjust to gravity. You'll feel pale, you'll feel weak, you'll feel unsteady, and you won't be able to function properly, but that won't matter to you. Because you, Team Pegasus and Eagle, have inspired millions. You've made discoveries that will shape the future of humanity. And you've encouraged and paved the way for the bravest among us to continue forging deeper and further into the solar system in the name of exploration and discovery. Now, get to work. You've got a moon to explore. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Quinn. I thought it was also worth mentioning that the skin suit technology, where there's a primary researcher from that's actually from RMIT here in Melbourne, Dr. James Walty. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of our 4 speakers for their excellent talks and open up the main part of the session, which is to yourselves. And so I'd like to invite any questions at all. There's no question too small, so feel free to put your hand up and direct your questions to either one of our speakers or the whole panel. Do we have mics or are we? Yeah, cool.
Good afternoon. To Dr. Cable, question about oxygen. Now, the partial pressure is 21%, so I wanted to know how low a pressure can we go and maintain that partial pressure to get enough oxygen, or how low a pressure can we go to with enriched oxygen before oxygen becomes too toxic?
So percentage and partial pressure, I'll just clarify, the fractional concentration of oxygen in the room right now is 21%. The partial pressure is 160 millimetres of mercury, whatever other that means in hectopascals. The percentage is kind of the key here in a way. So you can enrich an atmosphere to in excess of 21% if you reduce the pressure, but you have to be aware of the fire risk is the main problem. We all know Apollo 1 and what happened to Apollo 1, right? So when you start enriching an environment, it starts to get a bit problematic. But you can drop a pressure down to probably, I don't know, let's say an equivalent of 15,000 feet on Earth. which, if you enrich the concentration of oxygen you are breathing a little bit, is actually quite acceptable. It's like, when you go on, climb a mountain, you go to terrestrial altitude, the pressure of the oxygen is dropping around you. We can tolerate and adapt to that. If you oxygen enrich it a little bit, it's helpful because it helps wash nitrogen out of the body, which is protective from decompression illness as well. So it is certainly doable. You probably wouldn't want to do it lower pressure than about in a 15,000 foot equivalent, because if you enrich the oxygen too much, you start ending up with a fire risk, a fire hazard in a spacecraft.
I guess my question is, what is the minimum total pressure you can have of atmosphere, of whatever your oxygen dilutant mix is, before the amount of oxygen itself becomes too toxic? What's the lowest pressure you can have with the highest percentage of oxygen?
Okay, so I'm not sure of the exact data on that. The oxygen is toxic only in high concentrations for long periods of time. So you can breathe 100% oxygen for some hours and have no effect of that. You wouldn't want to be breathing that for months or days even. It would be toxic in that situation. The lowest pressure, I think, to minimise the risk of decompression illness would be no lower than an equivalent of about 18,000 feet on Earth. But they're not. The risk then becomes hypobarrier, risk of decompression illness, nitrogen bubbling out of your body. The risk at a 2-to-1 pressure change, about 18,000 feet, starts to increase. Once you get to a 3-to-1 pressure change, which is about 25,000 foot equivalent on Earth, then there is a very steep elbow in the risk curve, and you would have a substantial chance of getting clinical decompression illness at that point.
This question's probably directed at Rowena. When you mentioned nutrition in space, you touched on the gut health, and I was wondering, with extended periods of time in space in a fully sterile environment, does that have a negative effect on the immune system if you're not taking in new bacteria and new germs into your system? And also, maybe in the same thread, is there a chance that bacteria or viruses could mutate on long trips into space, and then could the astronauts bring back those different strains of whatever it is and infect people on Earth?
Thanks for the questions. I'll just answer the last part first, and there certainly is research which has been done in relation to bacteria and viruses to show that they do evolve and mutate in the space environment, and that they actually become more virulent than the ones that we have here on Earth. So what would happen over a very long period, I imagine that they would continue to mutate, and possibly not in ways which are good for us. And going back to the question of the gut microbiome, it's also thought that because your immune system does become less efficient and is affected in a negative way in extreme environments like being in space, that there would also be a negative effect on the gut microbiome, and so that would require support. Nutritionally is one way that we can do it, but of course you raise a really important point about taking in environmental bacteria as sort of positive stimuli for our immune system. And I think there's also a really interesting question of what if we strike new bacteria or new viruses which have evolved on another world, and how we're going to interact with that. And I always like to think of the example of the War of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells book, and you might have seen the movie, that it's actually the Earth bacteria that end up killing the Martian invaders. So would the same thing happen to us on a foreign world? I think it's all very interesting to think about. And if we do discover life on Mars, for instance, those sort of questions will come into play in a very realistic way.
Actually, I might just contribute too. I think planetary protection works in two ways. There's the potential for Earth contamination of other worlds, such as the Moon or Mars, but then, of course, we're concerned about bringing, as you say, viruses or bacteria, which are extraterrestrial, back to the planet. So we are concerned about contamination of, one would assume pristine worlds, but they may not. They may have their own life. And if we do find life on another planetary body, Moon or Mars, the question has to be asked then, did we introduce it accidentally, or is it actually native, indigenous life that was there? So that's always going to be a question, and that's where planetary protection comes in. But just a comment about the immune system. There was a study done recently that shows both innate and cellular immunity in humans decreases in remote environments. So Antarctica, for example, people wintering over there have a decrease in immune function, as astronauts also do. And a recent study shows that natural killer cells, which are the cells that kill malignant cells that crop up in your body, they don't work as well. So clearly there's a concern there with the radiation effect, malignancies arising and having decreased that sort of innate immunity. It's a concern.
Also, I can say that the like virus that we have, they can reactivate in our body as well. Some studies have shown that the immune system reduces, and some virus like herpes or stem virus, they can reappear in space. It will be one of the dangers that we have in deep space exploration.
Just a question from my side. From a longer-term perspective, is there any chance if humans are born off-world that they won't be able to go back to Earth? And longer-term, if we've got generations of humans living in space, could they branch off into like a separate species?
That's a very good question. I think the answer to that question, I mean, clearly we don't know, but the answer to that question, thinking logically about humans, how humans adapt and evolve, I think the logical answer is yes, we will. I mean, if humans do colonize and we work out how to reproduce on another world in a completely different gravity environment, radiation environment, pressure and oxygen environment, then the adaptations that we make, I think we'll see potentially a different subspecies of human evolve as a result of that. So our cardiovascular system will evolve differently. Our bone and muscle structure will evolve differently. But the question is, how does the reproductive process actually work in that environment? As so much of what we do in a reproductive physiology sense relies upon a 1G environment in many ways. So we have a lot of problems to solve, but there's very little hard evidence or research that can inform us about that at this point. I think it's going to be one of those things that we discover by doing. It's hard to simulate that on Earth.
And I might just add an extra point too. There's a concern about the effect that cosmic radiation can have on the germ cells, the cells that we actually use to reproduce with, and the possibility of DNA damage or mutations, which would then be passed on to offspring. So we've still got a lot of things to think about, I think, before we actually encourage people to reproduce in a space environment.
Thank you very much for your briefing and presentation. I'm sure we all, as a crew, feel prepared now. My question, I guess, to all of you, it has been inspired by Dr. Christensen's reference to the dome or the water-filled hood for surgical procedures, and also relating to the architectures that we know water will play an important radiation shielding role. Can you foresee or imagine a future lunar EVA water-filled or fluid-filled suit, like an extra blister, where we start to incorporate skin conditioning health fluids around the body as an extra body as well?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, a really interesting concept. And I'm just thinking of a movie, I can't think of the name of it at the moment, where they actually breathed in a liquid that supplied all the
abyss.
The abyss, yeah, supplied all the oxygen that they needed, and so I guess there's the possibility of something like that. I guess water is heavy, so the idea of having to carry around an extra fluid-filled shell, the sort of mechanical aspect of that, I guess you would need to think about in terms of whether the astronaut can actually carry that in addition to everything else. Spacesuits are already very, very heavy, but in terms of protecting them, I think that's a really interesting idea.
I think it does come down to functionality. Wearing something like that would make it very difficult from a mobility point of view with the astronauts, although in microgravity water doesn't weigh anything. But they've certainly explored other radioprotective materials which are lighter. Boron, nitrile nanotubes and so on have been looked at. There's some other materials which are radioprotective, but in terms of using water, the main strategy has been looking at encasing or surrounding astronaut habitats in the water supply and or fuel supply of the spacecraft, or habitat as hydrogen in whatever form, water or fuel, is the key. It's the protective element. I think a water-filled suit would be a challenge, a great idea, but we've certainly looked at water-filled suits in a terrestrial environment for the protection of pilots from the effects of G, because of the way hydrostatic pressure forces work in our 1G environment. Wearing a fluid-filled suit as a fighter pilot is actually a very good thing to do, but again it comes down to wearability, practicality, how heavy it is. There was a suit developed in Europe called the Labelle suit, which had some very, very fine ribs of fluid running up and down it, which did provide some very good G protection, but it actually wasn't superior to the other technologies such as the pneumatic G suit plus pressure breathing. So it was not taken on board as a technology, but an interesting thought for radiation protection.
We might have to take our last couple of questions. Any last few?
The astronaut Edgar Mitchell, reported a strange altered state that he experienced. This has led to a strange and kind of suspicious subculture, but it leads to the question, can the concatenation of all of these effects induce in humans a mental altered state that we're not familiar with?
Perfect question for the psychiatrists.
I'll just perhaps start answering that on behalf of Eduardo. Was it a question about how the space environment might alter a perception create altered perceptions, altered sense of reality potentially?
So, yeah, thank you so much for the question. Look, there are different experiences that astronauts have in space because of the change of the fluids in the body. There's some explanation. We really don't know. There is some change in the vision, particularly. When they see the surroundings, it's different that way we see. And some explanation is because the fluids inside our brain change, and in fact, the brain move. So not only the fluid that we have, we can say like free water, inside the brain change, but also the brain move. This movement of the brain made the ocular globe to be more flat, and this made the perception to be different. So there are different changes of the perception. One is the vision, which actually astronauts had problem to see the 3D dimension. So they had problem when they see when they are going to land a plane after they came from space. They have difficulties. There's one study. It was published in January this year, 2019, and this study showed 7 astronauts. They did an MRI, so an image in the brain, and they show how the fluid changed in the brain, and how the test they did was to drive a car in computer simulate. And no one could pass the test. All the astronauts failed the test because of the perception of the vision change, the 3D change. This is in regards of the eye. Now let's go to say about the ears, the sound. When they go to space, the sound change. There are different reasons. One is because our vestibular system actually changed in space. And there are some problems with our vestibular system. In our brain, the two elements in our brain change are the cerebellum and the vestibular system. They are the most compromised parts of the brain in space. So because of that, they have problems localizing things in 3D, but also to perceive the sound. The perception of the sound is different. Another element is color. The color change in space. And there are different studies showing why. Because it's the same phenomenon, because of the compression of the increase of the pressure in the brain. So the perception of the color change in astronauts in space. So this kind of thing, like color, the taste change. Even the smell can change. So this is why one of the problems is that when astronauts are in space, the cognitive status decline because all the surroundings change. How they see things are different. How the sound is different. And this is why the performance is getting less, and they have some problem with the performance. This is why many systems has redundant system. They can make like twice or 3 times to be sure that the system.
Yeah, the altered perception actually could be for good, not necessarily nefarious, in the sense that if you talk to the astronaut corps who have returned from space, they almost to a person report a phenomenon that we know as the overview effect. I don't know whether you've heard of that, which is a well-documented phenomenon, and it's not a perceptual change whilst they're there. It tends to occur once they're home, but I think it comes from the fact that you are viewing your home planet from a distance, and the moon even more so than low Earth orbit, and yet it happens in low Earth orbit as well. Astronauts return with a perception of the fragility of our planet, the thinness of our atmosphere as our only life support system, the sense that our planet is our only lifeboat in this cosmos of threat and risk and radiation, and a sense that there are no borders on this planet, and when they're on the ISS they look down on the world and they don't think of it as my country, they just think of it as us. And it's that perception, I think, which speaks to the value of exploration. It's not so much about what we learn of the planets we go to, it's more about what we learn about us. And I think that's the altered perception that happens to astronauts generally.
And it's very interesting because a study published in 2014 they showed that there is no religious concept. Actually, they don't think about religious. There is not. The study showed, and they did an interview to many astronauts, that the religious doesn't change, but the concept in regards to the air change. How to look after the air, how to protect our air. This is very interesting. The other phenomenon is called the salutation. I think you know about that. The salutation is when person goes, particularly in space, in a very difficult environment, they can create some very strong qualities. And these strong qualities is a positive effect of the situation in space to become positive in the life and to become quite positive when they come back to the Earth.
The overview effect almost affected the whole planet on Christmas Eve in 1968 when Apollo 8 sent back those pictures of Earthrise from the moon. Apollo 8 orbiting the moon sent back the images, and that made an enormous change, in fact, I think, in the population's perception of our planet, and in some ways perhaps even kick-started the conservation of our planet kind of movement on the Earth. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, but yeah, I think it's going to be even more prominent the deeper we go into space and the further we go from home.
So I think we better finish up there, but I'd just like to thank our 4 speakers for their fantastic talks and everyone for your great questions, and to Thomas and the Moon Village Association for inviting us up here. Thomas?
Yeah. Thanks again. Another fantastic session. You can start to see the threads going through from the first 2 sessions there. So thanks guys. You've been very coordinated and executed perfectly. So thank you. We'll have a short break again, and we'll come back at 4:15. Again, the Space Association of Australia up the back there. Terry Doherty's selling books up there. Please feel free to buy. And also note there's a flyer up there for Dr. Space Junk's book titled Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, Archaeology and the Future, published on April the 1st. So it's coming out April the 1st. And if you grab a flyer, you can get 20% off when you purchase the book. So yeah, have a good break. See you soon.